Hi everyone, my name is Mallory Treadway and I am the marketing coordinator at Keller Schrader. Today I'm joined by Josh Pack. If you haven't had a chance to listen to our previous webinars in the How to Get Better at Corporate Analytics series, or if you haven't had the chance to meet Josh Pack in person, here's a little more about him. He is a practice leader for strategic management and data science. He is part of our data strategy group, which partners with organizations to develop their analytics initiatives and capabilities from both a strategic planning perspective as well as designing and implementing data analytics platforms and solutions. He has 20 years of experience in roles ranging from operations analysis and data science to strategic planning and business development. He's worked in multiple sectors, including energy and utilities, financial services, process industries, and management consulting. And he holds a PhD in bio and environmental engineering from Cornell University, where he researched operations research models applied to biofuels production and supply chains. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Mallory. I appreciate the introduction. Thanks to everyone who's returning from previous webinars. We've spread this out over a few months and really appreciate the interest. Today, we're going to be continuing the discussion on how to get better at corporate analytics. Another way of thinking of this is the path to your data strategy. And these talks are really reflective of the data strategy framework that we developed when we began the data strategy group. So today we're going to be covering phases 2 and 3 of that framework, which are the architecture and procurement phases. I'm also going to do a brief recap of phases 0 and 1. This is a really great graphic that displays the phases of our data strategy framework, the exploration phase, the investment phase, architecture, procurement, implementation, and execution. Again, today we'll be covering architecture and procurement. First, let's recap the other phases that have been covered in previous webinars. We call phase 0 the exploratory phase. This is really before you've actually launched any sort of formal initiative or asked for any particular funding or capabilities. This is really kind of done as part of a phase of self-learning and deciding what does data strategy mean to us as an organization. Often this is done as sort of a champion part-time internally, perhaps in a particular department, perhaps more broadly across the enterprise. There are a number of ways that this exploration can be done, but essentially the steps are to do some self-reflection internally, and then begin a self-education that involves looking outside the firm, and then developing a basic strategic position paper, and then using that paper to gain approval to move towards developing a business case. And then that business case would be phase 1, where you end up launching the actual data strategy capability. So really the outcome from this exploration is a defined data strategy that upper management has at least committed to in terms of preliminary concepts, not necessarily a full-on investment of resources. Some of the main outputs that you get from phase 0 are artifacts of internal assessment, strategic priorities, an inventory of things that are already happening in terms of data and analytics, and then also probably a healthy long list of pain points or critiques or issues with data management inside the company. This can all be really great groundwork for building towards that need and defining that business case for actually implementing capabilities in this area. You also end up with a position paper. We call it the organizational data strategy position paper, and that needs to include some key things as we've covered in previous talks. You want to be defining kind of the industry trends in data management and analytics, also your own strategic priorities against those trends, and then be able to describe in this paper your current capabilities, both in terms of what's good and maybe the warts as well. And then finally, you want to have a very preliminary, very high-level strategic position statement that's really kind of a directional statement around where we want to be in terms of data and analytics. This is not necessarily a committed, bona fide strategic statement. Rather, it is something that can guide your planning efforts. And then finally, you want to be able to create a value proposition that does have an order of magnitude ROI around what's in it for the firm we don't do this just for our health or for the fun of it. We try to do this investment in data strategy in order to actually benefit the firm and the customers and the organization and the employees and potentially shareholders. And then finally, the outcome from this is the approval to move toward a business case. Essentially, it's a stage gate to get to the next phase. So you're going to gain executive agreement on this formal data strategy need. You're going to secure sponsorship in terms of getting the right executives and other champions to buy into and endorse the direction of exploring all of this and investing in it. And then you're going to get approval to develop that business case that I just mentioned. Ultimately, in this phase, it's an ask to approve the position paper and then move on to get a full business case underway. So that was exploratory. And then the next phase that I'll describe as a recap is the investment phase. And really, as I've probably said in previous webinars, this is the most important part of this entire work, being able to articulate and then muster the resources for the organization to actually implement and execute. So, in a nutshell, the investment phase is all about developing a self-funding business case to get approved funding to launch the data strategy. And the way that that's done is by surfacing the analytics use cases that are actually going to drive the value inside the organization. And more importantly, organizing them in an investment portfolio and selecting the ones that are going to be the most bang for the buck, have the fastest payback, or whatever other financial hurdle metrics are important to the firm, just like you would any other strategic investment. The phases of, or the steps of this phase are to carefully consider culture and sponsors, do a deeper study of the opportunity, usually involving external experts, and then launch a pilot project to the extent that you can marshal the resources at this stage, and then do a more in-depth capabilities current state, usually involving a number of surveys, more formal methodology than you did in the exploration phase. Ultimately, then you describe the data strategy narrative, which builds upon the data strategy position paper. And then that becomes the primary input to developing a financial business case that you present for approval to get funding and resources. And so really the outputs from this investment phase include an analysis of your culture and your sponsors, pretty well developed conceptual use case portfolio. You will have executed and learned from a pilot project and presented that previously in order to sort of showcase the art of the possible. You'll have a really deep understanding of your current state of affairs, both in terms of platforms, but also the prevailing attitudes and direction and drawbacks, limitations, and opportunities that the culture and the staff have decided or believe. And all of those things help you build this roadmap aligned to your corporate strategies. So, essentially, assuming that you have a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year corporate plan of some kind, it's critical that your technology and capability investments are aligned to that plan. So then you're going to develop this data and analytics roadmap in order to get you there in a strategic way where you're using your funds and resources wisely. All of these things essentially combine into what we just referred to as the data strategy narrative. And then this data strategy narrative becomes the starting point for actually delivering and presenting your business case. So from the narrative, you want to build out the pro forma cash flows. You will have had quite a lot of information at this point where you can go to that stage of developing the budget for your work, for your implementation, and then you're going to present. Make sure that the strategy narrative is really telling a story. It has to include these elements. It's got to be self-funding. You've got to demonstrate clearly that it aligns to the corporate strategy. Otherwise, it's easier to shoot down. You want to demonstrate that the use cases and activities and capabilities are aligned to your core values. And usually what we have found is that it's very helpful and a selling point to be able to tie data capabilities to the legacy of the current CEO. And that really ties into the longevity and sustainability of the firm after that CEO steps down. So we've encountered a number of executives and CEOs that really feel like they want to be able to say that, hey, on my watch, we implemented data capabilities. We became a data-centric or a data-oriented culture. With the cash flows, make sure you include staffing, platforms in terms of capital investment, software, which could be capital or ongoing expense, any sort of professional services to not only integrate that, but then potentially augment as needed over the time horizon. And then be sure that you've given an accurate assessment of what you believe the financial benefits are. You want to under-promise and over-deliver there. Don't try to make this a hype cycle, because there have been plenty of failed analytics and AI and data initiatives in all kinds of different industries. And then, of course, be able to demonstrate soft benefits like more satisfied young professionals. The word on the street is that your firm has really moved into the 21st century and modernized and is leveraging their data. All these sorts of soft benefits that accrue goodwill and so on are definitely a part of that. Finally, you want to present that business case. And again, it's important to know your culture. Make sure that you've kind of preceded and gotten informal buy-in from the champions and sponsors prior to this presentation. Make sure that you have orchestrated who's going to be in the room very carefully for the right sort of champions and supporters and funders. And then tell your story, like we described on the left-hand side under data strategy. Finally, you're going to make the budget ask. Make sure it's very clear and don't be shy about asking for it because you believe in it. And you want to be able to objection handle. And usually this means that you've thought about all the potential questions or hesitations and you've provided ample evidence to handle those objections in a well thought out, well constructed appendix as needed. So that's the essential delivery of your business case. So ultimately, if you've done all of these things, you can check the box on every step. And with a little bit of luck and a lot of preparation, you'll have your approved funding and resources. So all of that was recap of previous webinars. And, of course, the investment phase, critically important. So if you have not seen that webinar, I highly encourage you to go back and see that. So today we begin with a premise that you've been approved for funding and resources, and we're moving into the architecture phase. Architecture is really kind of a broad umbrella term here, not only for technology and platforms, but also for organization. You're kind of architecting your story. So this is architecture in a number of different meanings that we'll go over now. So really the key steps to this phase are to build your team, to define the platforms and environments that you're going to need, to define the use case portfolio process that you're going to use. And essentially that is developing criteria for selecting which analytics projects and products you want to use in order to get executive buy-in and agreement and consensus on the right way to choose those things. So we're literally talking about a very real portfolio management process there. We're going to cover that. We've already talked about it in past seminars. We're going to talk about it in future seminars. So just suffice it to say that that's something that you can be thinking about in the architecture phase. Finally, you're going to develop specifications that will be an input to procuring all the products and services, platforms, and capabilities that you're going to need in the subsequent phase. So really the output of this architecture phase are the requirements for implementation, including specifications for procurement. I've got a couple of key wisdoms here in the architecture phase. You want to staff the team promptly, preferably leveraging the earlier pilot team that you may have executed during the investment phase where appropriate. If there were individuals that were kind of missing from the landscape that you need to go out and hire, that's great. But ideally, you'll have people that are kind of ready to go and that you've already kind of groomed to come into this new group, which is going to have a lot of eyeballs, and you're going to want to have top people as appropriate. And then you want to include those team members on architecture design discussions and decisions. Of course, you will have already learned a lot from external sources and market scans and expert opinions and so on. But it's important to not get too far ahead of the team because you want them to buy into the platforms. We all know that technical folks can have very strong opinions about which tools and platforms they want to be involved with. So that's an important step. It's important to really not underestimate the scope, cost, or timelines. And I say that even given the fact that we're going to recommend that you stay narrow. So it's going to be important to choose some use cases that, you feel are going to be quick wins, but you don't want to underestimate what you need to execute those, especially since this is the early phase of getting this capability off the ground. So get what you need, but use what you get. It's kind of like the Chinese buffet, eat what you take. Please don't waste it. It's important to really think longer term. So you want to be living in the present and executing things well now, getting things off the ground. But ideally in this phase, you have already gotten approval to sort of the future stage gates of getting future funding. So you will have probably presented a 3 or 5 year budget, but you may not have had it secured or appropriated in the 1 year budget for each of the subsequent years. So it's important to have that front and center with your sponsors and build that out in a little bit more detail than had been done so far. I urge you to not compromise on the platforms. So again, stay narrow on use cases and err on the side of quality tooling, well thought out platforms, and enterprise architecture to implement analytics. Um, Again, be willing to reduce the scale of your efforts in year one, but don't compromise the tools and the quality. So what we mean by scale here is maybe don't do as many use cases, maybe don't use as many resources as you had thought, but by all means, you need to be focused on demonstrating the possibilities with the tools that you've secured investments for. So this is just to drive home a few of the points that I just spoke about. It's very important to choose the team wisely and involve them in the architecture decisions. And it's important to think about a nucleus of team and technology. You can't have one without the other. You've got to invest in the right tools, but if you don't have the right skills to match those tools, and if the tools are too hard to use or inappropriate to the skill sets you've assembled, you're kind of left with no capability at all. When you do your architecture phase, it's important to emphasize to everyone, all stakeholders, the team, champions, the potential target users, the sponsors, perhaps even the board, that really data is a supply chain. It begins in a moment of creation, which might be a mobile device, a sensor that's measuring, some kind of automation in the field or in a factory, the Internet of Things, social media data, whatever that data format and origin may be, that is the supply. It can even be keystrokes, which sometimes are written with errors, but still, that's the moment of data creation. On the right-hand side, ultimately for analytics purposes, you're going to be using that data to drive decisions, to envision the future, to potentially launch new products and services, create new applications, and so on. And in the middle, the magic happens. And that's really core to the strategy here. You have to be able to envision what are the capabilities, what are the tools, what are the business processes, and what are the opportunities for leveraging the data on the supply side to make use of it in terms of return on assets and return on investment on the demand side. So very critical. This is a related idea, a little bit of sort of qualitative technical architecture here. The data lifecycle management concept is one that says that you have to manage data from cradle to grave in order to accrue value to the data as an asset. And it's very important to think of data as an asset. So in the bottom left, core systems feed raw data as well as metadata. And for those not familiar with the metadata term, metadata is really descriptions of your data. So when was it produced? What does the field in which this data exists really means? When was it produced? What are the rules around that data? And so on. And so the data quality engine is something that adheres to the metadata rules in terms of data quality rules. So to give a simple example, a percentage has to be no less than 0 and no greater than 100. So if you have a percentage that's -1 or 101, that would be violating a data quality rule. So simply put, that data quality engine, of course, it's much more complex than that, and every organization is going to be maintaining those rules and passing that back and forth to the data governance platform and the metadata platform, which defines what the data is. I could go into much greater detail on this. I'll leave it there. but it's important to think about the management of data in terms of the quality and the metadata. In other words, what does that data mean to the organization? So finally, the data quality engine feeds data quality scores. Those data quality scores help to measure the health of data in your organization. And when data quality goes down, you know that perhaps your processes are broken or something's going wrong, or you haven't invested properly in the data management. And then ultimately, you get certified curated data that's healthy and useful for driving analytics in the company and creating value. All along that pathway, you see at the bottom there, I've got a little bracket that says data lineage documentation. That data lineage really helps you to certify and provide truth and reliability and trust in your data. So there are platforms and tools out there that handle all of these things. That is not the topic of today, but we just want to make sure that you have an appreciation for the importance of data lifecycle management. We've already alluded to the idea of the 5-year plan. When you do that, please consider the organizational design structure and how that evolves over time. The team that you have in 5 years will hopefully be more mature, perhaps larger and more specialized than the team you started off with your pilot project. So be sure to think about those sort of skills and capabilities evolutions over the planning horizon. And then be sure to think about how you want to scale and augment your platforms and tools, both in terms of the analytics capabilities as well as how they integrate to applications and other business processes and systems. And it's important to remind you that the roadmap here that I'm about to flash up needs to be driven by corporate strategy, like we talked about in the investment phase. So this is an example of a client project that we did that we literally talked through all these different capabilities, validated them as important to their organization, and then helped to qualitatively describe each of the capabilities and how they evolve over the time horizon. And then the purpose column is really kind of that drive the point home for an executive team. So this is a way of really culminating a 5-year roadmap on one simple graphic for C-level and board level, champion sponsors and investors. So, we highly encourage you to be thinking about this because this will guide your ability to budget and justify each of your sort of annual budget cycles. So again, this is a very useful tool that we've had great success with. Be sure it's tied to strategy. Behind this, if you think of another layer of this, you can really use this to help to develop more detail and annual budgeting plans for sort of the financial requirements of this. So you can imagine a spreadsheet that has all of the investment needs and the benefits intended and expected to match these qualitative statements. We've already mentioned, but this graphic will hopefully burn into your brains. Instead of defining and tackling a broad set of use cases up front, which can potentially sacrifice your ability to demonstrate the capabilities and potentially, sacrifice your ability to actually get a return on those capabilities, we highly recommend that you think about your use case portfolio, at least the ones you execute at the beginning stages. Keep it narrow. And we're talking about 1 to 3 use cases max in the first year. Okay. And why do we say that? Because we know executives are going to want to have payback, but trust us that it's better to deliver a solid project where you can demonstrate the benefits and showcase the technologies and skills that you've invested in the first year and go deep on your tech stack and capabilities. Can't emphasize this enough. Because if you err on the left side, essentially your efforts potentially get watered down. People don't believe in the benefits. They question the technical capabilities of something that we've always had, and why did you have to spend all this time and money? So we highly recommend the right-hand side, narrow set of use cases, deep tech stack and capabilities. So that was all the architecture phase. There's a lot more that could be said on all of that, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of the key components of the architecture, the key wisdoms, and the key tools that are used to develop all of that. So remember that the output from the architecture phase are the implementation requirements. which essentially are going to be culminated in a set of specifications for procurement. The procurement phase, even though there are several steps here in this phase, is relatively straightforward. What we recommend is that you try to follow your internal procurement and legal processes to the letter in order to really legitimize your efforts and not be viewed as something foreign to the culture or maverick or rogue to the culture. You want to make analytics feel like a natural extension of your culture. So the steps here are to develop the procurement plan, involve a number of stakeholders early, which we'll get into that. And then you want to leverage the procurement and other folks to request preliminary quotes from vendors and service providers. You want to develop tech specifications based on those early quotes. Then you want to launch, if appropriate, a request for proposal from various service providers along the different capabilities required. And then when you get that back, you want to compare to your planned budget, possibly adjust the budget if that is in the cards. Perhaps it's not. And then ultimately, once you have all that in hand, you want to be negotiating and executing those contracts, highly leveraging the procurement department in order to actually secure all the legalities and permissions to implement your platform and tools and capabilities. Ultimately, you end up with contracts and you are poised to actually implement. Tips in this procurement phase are, like we've said, be sure to include legal and procurement. If you get ahead of procurement, even though it might feel slow, uh, going around them is going to bite you because it'll be slower if you're not cooperating with them and you don't bring them in until the end, because they're probably going to make you rewind and start over. Be sure to include the legal departments and be educating your internal counsel on all the different sort of technological components so that they can properly read all the different license agreements and contracts. And that does require a lot of iterative discussion, because sometimes things like data ownership and the intellectual property of data or applications or concepts, especially if it's not an attorney who's familiar with intellectual property law, some of these things might be new to them. So that could take a little while. So treat them as partners, not as gatekeepers. Similarly, it's important to involve information security as a collaborator and let them know what you're doing. And in some cases, they can actually augment what you're doing and support you and become champions of what you're doing. Whereas if you include them last minute, they're probably going to throw up all kinds of red flags and slow you down. This is kind of back to the legal arguments here. Make sure you understand the terms and conditions of any sort of contract or user license agreement. What we have seen, and you've probably seen this too, is that often a proprietary vendor solution may actually leverage other embedded capabilities, even open source capabilities, which sometimes means that those open source capabilities involve public licenses. And attorneys may not be accustomed to using and reading and approving public licenses. And really, with a public license, there's nobody to redline and iterate with. So it's important to make sure you understand the hierarchy and dependencies among contracts and license agreements so that you can kind of guide the attorneys through the landscape and landmines and then get their professional opinion. Don't try to think of yourself as a lawyer, rather think of yourself as a guide to the attorney to make sure that you've walked them through this properly so they're comfortable with it. And in some cases, there's really no negotiation or redlining at all. For example, in the cloud, you either sign Microsoft's Azure agreement or you don't. There is no back and forth and redlining. So it's important to think about that and educate them early to get them comfortable with that. And then, once you've kind of gotten all those stakeholders comfortable and you've involved them, you want to be thinking about any cloud economics, which can be very different than sort of the on-prem economics and typical ways that finance departments are used to investing in capital for IT. Often the cloud economics discussion becomes one of, well, is this O&M or capital? How does it work? I don't understand the unit drivers. And often, as many of you probably know, cloud services involve all kinds of seemingly esoteric, um, pay per unit metrics that require a little bit of study even for you to make sure you can explain those to the other stakeholders like procurement and legal. So make sure you understand those and that your preliminary calculations on how to actually execute use cases aren't going to blow the budget because you haven't considered your cloud economics. And then it's important to not lock into contracts that don't have convenient exit clauses. There are going to be vendors who are really in business to secure long-term revenue from you through very bulletproof contracts. So it's important to leverage your sort of internal wisdom and procurement and legal departments to make sure that you don't fall into those traps. So that was the procurement phase. And next time we will probably combine the implementation phase and execution phase into a comprehensive webinar for you all. And in that phase, we will probably recap what we just discussed, as well as the exploratory and investment phases. And we'll again drive home points around culture and self-funding business case and use case development and management. So I hope that you've gotten a lot out of this talk today. If there's any one thing that we take away from this, we really want to emphasize the importance of culture here. This has been a very kind of, technical and block and tackle kind of talk, but I'm just hearkening back to earlier talks where we heavily emphasized culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you want your analytics efforts to make a difference, focus on the people, processes, behaviors, and especially culture more so than technology and data. So with that, I will thank you and appreciate your time today.